Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars video, and it's Friday, so you probably know what you're getting today if you somehow clicked on this video without looking at the title. We're talking about The Bad Batch, and specifically Season 1, Episode 7, Battle Scars. Now, there's going to be full spoilers in this video, so if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to leave. But my very brief impression is that this was easily my favorite episode of this series so far. It had everything: incredible visual effects, interesting storyline, and I've actually seen this a lot from people. A lot of people are putting it right up there with the series premiere, which I also liked, but I actually thought was a little too bloated. They could have maybe trimmed a bit of the fat from episode 1, but given the fact that it was one entire 70-minute long episode, I'm not going to complain at all. With that being said, from this point on, spoiler warning, let's talk about Battle Scars. So right off the bat, again, full spoilers, I gotta give myself a little credit. Not for coming up with the theory, but for, I guess, paying attention to people who are more observant than I am. This episode saw the Bad Batch, as I predicted, going to Bracca, finding a Venator-class Star Destroyer in order to help them remove the inhibitor chip from Wrecker, who is on the fritz, to put it lightly, but of course also the rest of the squad. And yeah, there was a theory that I supported that the Bad Batch would use the medical center on a Venator because that's how Rex got his chip out, that's what he's familiar with, and that just made a whole lot of sense. However, I also do have to admit that I may have been wrong about something because I guessed that it was most likely Bail Organa at the end of the Martez Sisters episodes. Now, that's certainly still possible, but all evidence seems to indicate that it was actually Rex they were talking to. Admittedly, I did have him as my second most likely candidate. The robe did seem to match Bail's quite well, but yeah, without any further evidence, I'm going to assume for now at least that that was Rex they were talking to. But there's something else too that I've kind of been pointing out, and that's the fact that the show is heading to a more dramatic latter half of its season, and we got that with this episode. First of all, we have Wrecker versus the Bad Batch, something that's been teased throughout the past few episodes, but we also now have the return, presumably next episode, of Crosshair, or at least the Empire. I think it's actually very interesting how the show's set up Crosshair, where we split between Crosshair and the Bad Batch, and since then, I don't think he's appeared even once, so that's interesting. So we'll have another direct confrontation in the next episode. This is a nice kind of two-parter where we'll be leading in directly into the conflict next time because of those damn Baraka guildsmen. But yeah, this episode did mostly what I was predicting it would do, and pretty much exactly what I was hoping it would do. The stakes were up. This didn't feel like the crew was being sidetracked. Overall, it was just great. But let's talk more about specifics of the actual episode, and the first thing I want to touch on is the absolutely jaw-dropping, incredible visual effects that we were given, that our eyes were given to feast on for this episode. The Bad Batch has looked phenomenal throughout its entire run. It's somehow been a step up even from the Clone Wars Season 7, particularly when it comes to lighting and scene composition, in my opinion, but this episode brought that to the very next level. So Baraka, in my opinion, looks better and more interesting than it did in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Of course, the planet appears there. That's where Cal Kestis is working at the beginning. And I mean, first of all, we have just the scale of the things. One thing I want to note is that there were a bunch of cool ships there. Pretty much everyone spotted that Hammerhead. I believe there's also a Providence. But what's really interesting is that the Venator seemed like a massive capital ship for one of the first times, because in Clone Wars, I never really got that feeling, and that's something that's hard to portray even in live action. But standing in the graveyard really put things into context, and I thought that was overall excellent. But it was also very interesting just from a lighting perspective, because they were walking through these ruins, they were going between shadow and light. The light was soft at times, it was illuminating particles in the air. All in all, it was just really impressive, especially when you have these updated Rex armor pieces, some of which is probably a copy from Season 7, some of which has probably been further altered. But the most impressive thing for me was probably that water shot. We had some other cool water effects from The Mandalorian. That one scene where the Razor's Crest is being pulled out by a crane was amazing, and what we get in this episode is just really next level for an animated series. That's been one of, I think, the positives of Disney Plus, something that George Lucas probably would have appreciated. They've taken these shows like The Mandalorian, now The Bad Batch, and they've used them to obviously test new state-of-the-art types of filmmaking and animation, and it's paying off in this show. And I know I'm talking a lot about just visual quality, but I just don't think you can take enough time to really appreciate how lucky we are to be getting this quality of animation in a 16-episode season with episodes releasing every week. week. It's insanely impressive. As for the actual plot, though, I think the biggest kind of downside of this episode was that Rex was spoiled in the previews. I mean, but for those previews, I probably wouldn't have expected Rex to appear at least this early. I mean, there were definitely hints that we'd see him eventually. He was mentioned earlier on in the series. Of course, we know what we know from Star Wars, Clone Wars, and the Rebels, but I do wonder, what is Rex up to at this point? Because he hasn't joined the rebellion. He's probably maybe met up with some other clones or is off doing something else. I do wonder whether this show is eventually going to go more Clone Wars style and give us some perspective switching. You know, we have the Bad Batch, we've had Crosshair. Is there going to be like a Rex only episode? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if I want that, to be fair, either. I found it interesting too how a lot of things were happening in this episode, and of course we do get the action scene with Wrecker sort of going crazy, which was pretty much as terrifying as we were all expecting, and even Wrecker wasn't able to really fight off the inhibitor chips, even when, you know, close to perhaps killing Omega, which is certainly troubling. But even that action scene notwithstanding, it was kind of interesting how a plot-heavier episode did take some time to slow down, kind of reflect on everything that's happened. Order 66 has clearly affected everyone just terribly, and yeah, that was really interesting to me. I really enjoyed that. I'd say probably the only bit where they missed the mark on that was with Echo. Echo, I think they've been doing a fairly good job with. Not quite as good as Wrecker or Hunter, but better than Tech, who's gotten the least character development in my opinion. And I would have liked to see him maybe talk about fives with Rex. I would have liked to see him at least react a little bit, because of course Echo is not an original member of the Bad Batch. He was a brother in arms with Rex, and he kind of just ended up sort of falling into the background. That's a bit of a disappointment from my perspective, at least. But I don't know, I don't have too much more to say about this episode. I enjoyed the pacing, I enjoyed the visuals, as I stated. The sound, as always, was good. The plot was interesting, maybe a bit predictable in that, well, it was predicted, but it was also an interesting setup for next week's episode, and next week we know is going to be action-packed. I'm kind of glad to see the Empire back. That should be fun. Speaking of, though, it was at the very beginning nice to just see the Bad Batch being chased by random spaceships. They weren't, you know, modified TIE fighters or modified Clone Wars fighters. These were just like a local garrison or private force or something chasing the Bad Batch. And it's nice to be reminded of that part of the galaxy, because I sometimes did feel like the Clone Wars fell a bit too much into there's 3 starship types, everyone uses them. That was obviously for budgetary concerns, but I just appreciate when we get to see more sides of the universe. And we got that at the very beginning. It was a nice setup. I enjoy that they keep going back to this bar and how they're in a kind of rough situation. It'll probably be where they're centered for the next little while, which is why the fight's on Baraka, probably, so they can return there. I think it's Ord Mantell. But that's all I've got for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and my review. Do you have any questions you'd like me to answer next time? Leave them down below. Until then, though, be safe, have a good one, and may the Force be with you.